Could I please have our panelists make their way to the stage? Please have our panelists making their way to the stage. All right, given that we've had limited time for questions and a busy day so far, we wanted to have an opportunity to have a panel discussion of our distinguished speakers and guests here. Of course, we have Taylor Wilcox, we've got Louis Bernatchez, Heath, Caren Helbing, Chris Wilson, Karen Goldberg, and Sherry Walker, the National Manager for Genomic Programs at DFO. Did I get that right? Biotechnology. Almost. I should know that. I teach in a biotech master's program. And we did include in the program some of the information about some of the training programs that we have here at Guelph that feeding into this kind of research, our biodiversity majors, our biotechnology graduate program, our bioinformatics graduate program. Guelph is trying hard with other educational institutions across Canada to meet the demand of highly qualified personnel to be able to bring these kinds of tools to the field, working under the guidance of our esteemed colleagues who pioneered a lot of this work. So I'd like to start off by just getting a brief perspective from each of you on whether or not we need a national network for eDNA in Canada.
So recently we had a workshop for DFO to facilitate engagement of our clients in resource management as well as our scientists. And it was a very productive workshop last spring, and to share the research that's ongoing, but also to understand the client needs. And I think that kind of network is very important, not only just at a single workshop, but to continue. So at that workshop, we got into some very technical discussions on eDNA. And so we're currently, we had approval from our ABM to establish an eDNA technical working group to continue those discussions and to move towards best practices and minimum reporting standards for that. Now, it would be ideal, I think, to broaden that to the, this has been a wonderful workshop, and I learned so much, to broaden that to the academic community, to industry, and other departments and agencies, provincial government, and so forth, so that we have a more wholesome perspective on eDNA.
I think I'd like to just echo how important it is to have groups talking with each other. I'm not sure what an official network looks like, but I know a lot about what unofficial networks look like. And we have a group that gets together on the phone every month in the States, and I think this was you're on there too, right? Yeah, it's government eDNA working group, and they let me call in. I do a lot of work with government agencies too. So that's been really helpful in just getting everybody on the same page and talking about issues and having these real conversations about stuff we see in the lab that's confusing, and how should we interpret it, and it really broadens people's understandings and helps everybody keep up on what's going on. So I think that's helpful. I wanted to just say that critical considerations paper that I led on, its goal was to have minimum guidelines and best practices. And so that's what we were trying to do, and there are some minimum MIT guidelines in there about reporting for eDNA, and it might be that people know that, but it's not meeting the needs of the community, which is fine, but I just wanted to point out that it's a smooth start.
Yeah, it's very different to be able to actually be sitting next to someone instead of a voice on the phone. I don't know if we need a national network, but I do think we would all benefit quite a bit from it. We would be able to sort of muddle along, but we would work much better and more productively at having sort of facilitated communication among groups, so you don't have labs working in isolation. And you can form that virtual critical mass and find out who's pursuing the same questions, working on similar species, you can compare assays. So it hugely speeds up both the development and the implementation. I think it would be very good return on the investment.
So in British Columbia, we just recently in May had an eDNA workshop that I hosted at the University of Victoria, and we had a similar mix of folks from government, industry, and all over the place, including far away as Alberta. It was a regional meeting, about a third of the size of this. And it's really striking how like we could basically superimpose the meetings on top of each other in terms of what the needs are, what the excitement is about eDNA, and what the complexities are. And this eDNA stuff, it's not simple. It's very complicated, and you know, and the people that are needing to use it are not just limited to one location necessarily. Like it's a national thing, it's an international thing to some degree too. So it really is a good idea to get people together that have been struggling with similar problems, similar ideas and so on, and share those ideas to just make it more powerful.
Thanks. I think that meetings like this go a long way to sort of building bridges between researchers, but the thing that's really important to me in terms of a network is a formal network, and that's training and money. And one of the things that's hard on the trainees, the students in our labs, they learn one technique. And as we're finding out today, there's a lot of varied techniques and approaches and implications of eDNA, and a network would open up a whole pile of HQP or students to the opportunity. The other is money. To solve a lot of the problems we're talking about, it's going to cost a lot of money. I don't see industry coughing up a lot of money for such an early stage opportunity, but this sort of leads into what I think Louis might comment on is the change in our national funding for networks.
Well, I think everything I would see as beneficial has been said in terms of so I don't know if we need that much money as a start. At least have a forum of communication. And I've learned so much today about the needs from the industry, from the consultants. I hope they've learned what's going on in academia in terms of new development, and the same thing for government agencies. So we need that forum where we interact and communicate together if we want to move towards what we're talking about, moving towards standards. So we need to understand the diversity of where we need standards, the type of application that a consultant needs to handle to address the needs of their clients and stuff. We're not necessarily always aware of that in academia, and the other way around. A forum like that can be a fast lane for people from either government agency or the consultant to be quickly informed of what's the hottest recent publication to improve the methods and things like that. So it can only be beneficial. But I was not thinking about something like needing like a large pile of money to get started, and at least putting the seeds and go from there.
I guess maybe just the one thing that I would point out is that, you don't have to start from scratch as far as thinking about what a network could look like. I know that, so Caren brought up a really good point that there's a technical working group in the US, but there's certainly models in Europe, the DNA Aquanet, for example. I know that there's efforts in Australia and Japan. I'm sure that there's others that are a little less visible to me, that I'm not familiar with. But there might be some kind of, this didn't work, this worked really well, things that, folks who just happen to get started on this a year or two ahead of time, might be able to learn from, to set yourself up for success when putting together a network.
I would agree, and you mentioned DNA Aquanet, and that was part of what had sparked my thinking for this panel discussion, and personally why I feel like Canada could benefit from a structured national network is so that we don't lose our competitive advantage in this space. We've developed a lot of DNA techniques here in Canada, and it's somewhat disappointing to see other jurisdictions implementing them before we do. That's just my 2 cents. Do we have, I guess one of the other questions that's really on my mind is, in terms of different kinds of controls, to make sure that we're minimizing false positives, false negatives, properly quantifying the extent to which they may be a problem in the data sets. It seems to me like we've heard about different approaches designed to do different things. So, Caren, your lab has developed the algal assay to make sure that there isn't degradation of the sample in transit. But then, Chris, your lab has got the artificial insert to look for more lab contamination. And in other labs, we've certainly been custom developing IPCs that are of similar length and GC composition as a target that we can put in very low volume in our assays to help look for inhibition. It seems like we've each come up with a need for a different kind of control. Do we maybe all need to be using all of them?
I think what would be really wise is to have a good sit down to kind of figure out, okay, what are the things that we need to control for? What are the things that we need to have information for, like inhibition, like degradation, like did somebody screw up with the bleach bottles, that kind of thing, right? And figure out what would a control or controls look like to cover the types of things that we need to know in order to have confidence in mitigating false negatives and false positives. And that includes things like what you've mentioned, but also things like running negatives, plate negatives and plate positives for every plate you run. Making sure that you have field site positives incorporated in your thing, or distilled water filters incorporated in your field samples, etc., etc. So like really looking at what are the dangers, like what are contributing to false positives, false negatives, and what are the most effective ways of mitigating those.
So to follow up on that, I think there are some that everybody should think very seriously about adopting, and the one that really stands out is the degradation issue. That most of us are not testing for that, and without looking, we are blind on that front. So I don't think it has to be one particular assay that people have to adopt, but be able to say we are addressing this stage of the process and have a documented method for testing. So my way of testing for lab contamination, I don't think everybody needs to adopt, but there should be safeguards in place. People can develop their own or use somebody else's, but be able to have defensible criteria every step of the process to say this is why I have confidence in the outcome from this step. So the degradation one we've thought about, I've read the paper and liked it, we haven't implemented it. And I'm a little ashamed to admit that because we need to.
I want to speak to that a little bit. So we haven't implemented that, and although I think it's a good idea, and I was talking to Caren about this earlier, is because for us it's another expense, and that drives up the cost of samples. And we have criteria and pathways of doing things in which it's not usually a problem. Which is not to say that it's never a problem. And there are times where people do things wrong in the field, and we get really poor detection, and we follow up and figure out, like the crew that put their water samples in the cooler, but they didn't put any ice in the cooler, and they left it in the sun. So there are times when it would be extremely helpful, but I also worry that if we do everything that we possibly can, we're going to drive the cost and the challenge of doing these samples up in a way that's going to make it more difficult to do this kind of work.
Yeah, I just want to second what Caren described is that I think when we've thought about controls, I think it's really helpful if it's possible to quantify the power that you're getting out of your control. So right, when we take an eDNA sample, we all wear gloves, right? Do we actually know whether or not that reduces contamination? Well, no, we don't, but gloves cost 5 cents, right? So why wouldn't you wear them? But some of these things are really expensive. So like if you're traveling in a remote area and you decide that you're going to collect a field blank that's 1 liter of distilled water with every sample, your sampling costs have doubled, and your frame pack is packed with distilled water that you dump on the ground every kilometer. And so it would be helpful when you think about what controls you're using to determine how useful is this, how much power do I have from it? Am I, for the amount of cost I'm getting, am I getting a benefit? So things like the degradation control, if there was evidence that with the protocols that we're using, it has a big impact. If it was 10 to 25% for our protocols, as was suggested, and we could show that, then it would be worth the cost. But for example, protocols we're using right now, I know that we have greater than 90%, often 100% detection at places where we know that the species is. So it's mathematically possible for us to have a 10 to 25% degradation rate. But that doesn't mean that that's universal. It's just that when you bring up a control, is it actually a powerful control or is it just expensive? And that's not just picking out one. That's just an example. Trying to put it in terms of power for the cost. In the same way, if you think about detection probability, when you want to pick up the DNA, it would be useful.
Sure. Just not to make this like a huge back and forth. We can discuss this way more later. But something to consider is also like how it's implemented. So many people have talked about like using the Zymogen kits for cleaning up their samples, and so something like knowing whether like using something like the endogenous chloroplast test, which also works for plants, by the way, like something like that where you're directly assessing what the quality of that sample is that you actually have collected physically without adding anything to it. You can do the test for like literally dollars, like not very much. Do the test, know whether or not the test passes muster. If it doesn't pass muster, it's either inhibition or degradation. So then you apply a Zymogen kit to that particular sample, not all the samples within your test, or within your project, and then you rerun it again, check and see if it still fails the test, well then it's not a good sample. If it passes the test, woohoo, you can then test for your target, and you have that additional confidence that it's actually working. So in my opinion, I think something like that's critical for actually making a clear decision in terms of whether it's a good quality sample or not.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that has been useful in a learning opportunity for me as well, because when we began to adopt this more of a point of need pipeline, we were trying to minimize both false negatives and false positives. And the idea of filtering your sample and preserving it right at point of collection, rather than transporting water samples to a lab, should minimize some of those false negatives from degradation. But we don't actually have a test to confirm that. We're operating under the assumption that this is a better way. Similarly, by doing the qPCR in the field or field station outside of a research lab that's been contaminated with probably trillions of PCR products, like our Biodiversity Institute of Ontario that's been barcoding everything on the planet for more than a decade, that we're also minimizing that risk of false positives from lab contamination. But in terms of really taking a hard look at potential for false positives even in that situation, we haven't. I've taken more of the approach that if I get even 1 out of 6 detections in the field for, say, red side days, that's probably likely to be a true positive as opposed to a false positive. So we clearly need to reevaluate these things. I have honestly a very hard time understanding how I could get a false positive like that in the field, but it does happen. And so we've got to figure out how to implement the controls. And I think Tato's point was really a good one of potentially doing the cost-benefit analysis that will prioritize the number of controls you need relative to the number of samples you're taking, and put some of this together. So Caren, how much of this do you feel like is already spelled out in your guide?
Well, these details are not, and I think that's because we couldn't come to a consensus, because there's really good reasons why each of us has these different workflows for these different goals that we have and different systems we work in, and different ways that we've chosen to optimize things. And so those things are not there. What is there is writing out that you need to write about what you did do, right? So if we don't test for degradation, then I know that if I get a negative, one of the possibilities is that sample degraded on the way to the lab, right? But if I tested for that, that would be a known and not an unknown. So it's a choice.
And Sherry, perhaps you might comment on how much do you think regulators will dictate to us what we should do? If you're developing a technical working group in PFO, do we just wait for you to tell us the answers?
I think it should be a collaborative approach myself. But one aspect I would like to mention was one thing that came out of the our workshop that was held last spring, was that we need further understanding of the ecology of the science of eDNA in the field, so not only the persistence and the degradation, but the behavior of that in the field and the different sources. So that is the resuspension from the sediment and so forth, and how does that work, and what are the rates, and that sort of. So there's that basic scientific understanding that was still needed, and that needs to move forward. And lost my train of thought. Sort of looking at the time, I'm afraid I have to leave in a few minutes. Yes, but the other aspect was I have heard from we call them regulators, I call them our management community, was they want to know, well, what are the minimum reporting standards? What does this, somebody mentioned it earlier, what is this weak false positive or slight negative or whatever is being reported there? What does that mean? And we did have one ask, what is the statistical power of this? Now I did hear somebody mention type 1 and type 2 errors, so I'm not sure, I'm not a researcher, but is it possible to determine the statistical power of these tests? And I think that would help give confidence back to the regulators regarding what is the meaning of the results.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, and it's hard to stay on top of this rapidly growing literature, but lots of us have done lots of case studies that made us were originally skeptical that eDNA would work. So it's interesting that it's working a little better than I thought. So we've got a big accumulation of case studies, but maybe not these kinds of somewhat, from a conservation perspective, less sexy, but more necessary power analyses on the methods themselves.
One of the key things about the eDNA testing period is that everything hinges on the assay. Every single test hinges on the assay performing to your expectations. And so it's really, really important that we nail down those minimum requirements in terms of like what constitutes a good assay, what constitutes a reliable assay, and that we have reporting of that as a normal part of any eDNA assay, so that it can, that part is then solid. So then we can address things like go back and look at those really critical questions of how long does DNA last for and stuff like that, and under various conditions, et cetera, all those key questions. But if the assays aren't good, the data aren't good. Oh, the question of power. Okay, so the question was about
later. Right now,
power. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Actually, I'd just like to follow up on the assay point. It's actually a really critical point, because when you test, what gets interpreted is the species there or not, but the result you're getting is the result from your assay. So it's really how well is the given assay performing under these conditions. They won't all be equally good, and it seems like splitting hairs, but it's a very, very important distinction between interpreting as the species versus the results of the assays. So multiple people have talked about working on brook trout, doing eDNA. Probably those assays are not equally sensitive or equally specific. So when the US federal agencies were looking at how well do their detection systems work for Asian carp, several labs had developed multiple markers for big head carp and silver carp, and they did a round-robin study to see how well did they work, having the same set of samples, testing in different labs, testing out these different assays. They did not all perform equally well. So one of the things that would benefit from coordination is we could try different assays for particular species of interest and be able to say, these ones give us the most confidence. This one needs some improvement. But when somebody sees that end result, it will be, oh yeah, we found this species. So, well, no, that assay detected that particular taxon, and here was the cutoff for it. So, Caren already made the point, it's just worth reinforcing. I had said earlier, data cannot lie, but it will be misinterpreted. That is the single biggest way to misinterpret it, is say, here's my species answer. It's like, no, this is what my assay is telling me.
So I think all of what just got said is really important, but I'd also like to emphasize the field side of this, how these samples were collected, where they were collected, how much water was there, what time of day was it, or what time of year was it, compared to the ecology and activity of the species is going to be really important. So I think to go back to that, the type 1 and type 2 errors, this is connected to the whole workflow, which starts with sample collection and sample design and goes through what assay gets used and how it gets interpreted. And so I don't think that we're ever going to come up with a standard for eDNA, right? I think we're going to come up with standards by species or maybe by communities, by systems, but it's going to be individual.
And the point of assays, and to your point about where they're used, I mean, this is something that I've had a lot of concern about. So we've looked at whitefish in the Great Lakes. We've got really good sampling of whitefish haplotype diversity for the Great Lakes. We can make a great assay, but whitefish occur across all of northern Canada. And I haven't tested my assay for whether or not it will work on haplotypes, say, in Great Slave Lake in Alberta. So when you've developed an assay, you also have to think about the reference specimens that you use to construct it and the unknown haplotype diversity that may be out there in the wild. So just because someone has published an assay for, as you say, brook trout or whitefish, If it was developed in a particular area regionally, it may not be appropriate to be using it outside of that region without more validation. And who tracks that? What I would like to see is, as we develop new assays, people very seldom report on the multiple sequence alignment that they use to develop it. And so we've got some number of specimens per species and then some closely related species that we want to make sure it doesn't amplify. But over time, we're going to accumulate more knowledge about more haplotype diversity in a given species. You may actually want to come back and add to that multiple sequence alignment and test to see, in sort of version 2.0 of my assay, is it really robust in light of new knowledge about new haplotype diversity? And I don't see our community really reporting on that at all. But maybe I'm just missing something.
One of the other things about switching to qPCR is that every positive comes with a confidence. So it's not just somewhere along the line somebody's decided that there's a threshold CQ and drawn the line and said that's above it is positive, below it is positive, above it is negative. But in fact, if I'm trying to interpret that when I'm reading a paper, the first thing I say is you have to tell me not only what the mean CQ is, but what the variance is. And if the CQ is 39, that's a weak positive. If it's 22, it's a strong positive. If you've got one that's 22 and a bunch that are 0, then you realize you've got potentially a technical problem in the lab. So that the more information you give, other people who do molecular genetics can interpret it. But I question whether it's valuable for the managers or whether it just makes things more complex.
I think Taylor wanted to say something.
So I think that I get very impassioned about validating qPCR programs, because that's what I spend a lot of time doing and making sure that it's going to be regionally appropriate. But I really appreciate that Vasco brought up. For metabarcoding, this is important too, and I think that I know we're doing a lot of qPCR discussions, but I think there sometimes can be this impression of like, well, qPCR, you have to get it just right, and sometimes that's just too much work, so we'll just do metabarcoding. And so you just grab some primers and run with them, because that just gets everything, right? But actually, as Vasco pointed out, and everyone really knows at some level, metabarcoding doesn't magically get everything if it's on biases. And so we should temper our expectations for the amount of kind of work that has to be done to getting metabarcoding going as well. There should also be an assay validation process before you bring primers from the barcoding from one system into another. So I just wanted to drop that.
I just wanted to draw a little graph for you here. And this is a binomial error graph. The binomial error graph goes like this. And over here is 0 detection. There's none of your target DNA. You are have absolute confidence in your call at that low level. And then when you start actually looking at low concentrations of DNA, your binomial error rate goes up quite a bit, and then stabilizes, and then it starts going back down again to like higher DNA levels, and then where you're like 100% confident that there's no error. And guess where we are most interested in most of the time? It's where that binomial error is the highest. So the trick is to, and this goes back to some of Caren's points, is to figure out what the context is in which you are applying your test. If you're applying your test where you really are like expecting to detect really strong signal or not much at all, and you're not so much interested in the in-between part, well then, you can design your experiment that way, and have a limited number of technical replicates. But most of us are probably in that weird zone in between where the error is, 15 to 20%, in which case appropriate replication has to happen there in terms of technical replicates. So it really does have to be recorded, spelled out, and thought about.
And I wonder if we're operating primarily in that space, then should we be shifting gears to droplet digital PCR?
Sure, that costs money, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, the more I hear the panel, the more I feel we need the network, and the more I feel we need money actually. Because I don't know how the people from the consultant they feel. Like I feel less safe than this morning about doing eDNA actually. So I don't think we're sending a message of that that we're really safe yet to move on with standards and this and that, because it seems like we're sending the message that we still have lots to learn to start being safe. I feel kind of more confident than that, but I mean, taking all evidence together, it seems that yeah, we need a network because who else gonna do like this applied experimental work that we need to do to address those questions about understanding the impact of this and that. If it's not in academia, that's where it has to be. But if you want to address the right question in doing so, you need to do that in partnership with people that will be using those methods. So we need partnership money, and we need a network. Quick.
The one other thing that I think speaks to the need for a network, and I think it should be obvious, Taylor certainly made this point, but the importance of archiving these extracts. One of the concerns I have of just this loose diaspora of labs doing things and graduate student projects moving on is really important samples being lost, or a freezer gets unplugged, or someone becomes emeritus and their dean unplugs their freezer for them. We've seen sad cases like that, but if we don't have a more focused network, we won't be able to coherently archive these extracts. And I think that could be one key, very pragmatic objective of a network.
Well, how certain are we that the archive samples are not contaminated?
That's a fair question.
Many years ago in British Columbia, there was forest renewal BC, which was guilt money that was being fed back into the system. And one of the proposals was to create an archive of all of these forest harvest impact species, all the tissues and all the DNA. And the group was given an initial shot of $5 million. And after a couple of years, they came to the conclusion it was not feasible because there was no interest in paying the ongoing costs of continuing to archive it so that it was accessible and paying the power bills in replacement for the freezers. So archiving is an enormously complex thing to do as a central effort. It works terribly in individual labs, but it sort of stumbles along. Now, I'd be happy to hear anybody who has a different experience, but other than biomedical, where they've got more money than they know what to do with, I don't know if very many, even seed banks are getting shut down because governments are deciding, they've been around 20 years, nobody used them, shut them down.
I can speak to that a little bit from my background at the American Museum, where we set up a cryogenic collection, and also, for those of you who haven't heard, the Canadian Museum of Nature just launched a large-scale cryo collection, and they were one of the earliest adopters of a new technology that uses vapor phase liquid nitrogen freezers, but instead of having to have a supply of liquid nitrogen, this new generation of LN2 freezers actually has an acoustical condenser that just plugs into a 110 outlet, recondenses its own liquid nitrogen, has much lower operating costs than a -80, much longer lifespan, doesn't throw off all the heat like your -80s do. So there are new generations of archival technology coming out. And here in Canada, Canadian Museum of Nature, they've just installed 6 of these new MVE LN2 systems and are looking for some raison d'etre for this new collection that they've just established. So we might have the opportunity to stuff them to the gills with environmental DNA samples.
Just on the archiving point, that I think it's really good to have a reality check and recognize that it's not true. It's not like you just set this up. But I really hope that we can somehow capture folks' imagination about this, because I think it has a tremendous amount of potential. Because we're talking about how excited we're about eDNA right now. Well, sequencing technology is evolving really rapidly. And so I don't think that we have a grasp of what things are going to look like in 10, 20 years. And so if we can save these samples even just for a decade and maintain their integrity, then we're buying access to technologies that we can't imagine what kind of insights they might provide us with. And even just in the short term, we've done some cost comparisons. We think that the logistics of just organizing sample collection, extraction, and getting it archived is 60% of our qPCR cost. And so, there's immediate cost savings. And so, while I recognize it's hard, I'm hoping that there's some audience that has some money that can see that there's long-term cost savings potential here on a really large scale.
I would say let's take some concluding remarks from each of the panelists in turn. You have the microphone.
Maybe I'll just make that my concluding remarks. I shouldn't go first. Yeah, thank you very much for having me out here. It's really been a privilege and excited about the level to which there's network with industry, with academia, and with government right from the get-go. And without saying anything negative about what that interaction has looked like anywhere else, it's just exciting to see that right from the start, so there isn't kind of a disconnect and things start going off in a direction that's going to make bridge building more difficult in the future. So it's great to see this start here in Canada.
We need a network.
I agree. I think that an informal network to start, and then actually going aggressively after funding for a real network to do, as Louis said, the basic stuff that I certainly don't have the money for. I have money to solve problems, not to spend 2 years validating and exploring the difference between naked DNA and DNA adhered to colloids. So these are all questions that need to be addressed, and they aren't with the type of funding, at least that the My Lab's getting.
We also need to encourage the companies that make digital PCRs to actually make them reasonable in terms of handling the number of samples like that we normally process. That would be really good. And I'm gonna wait for my actual final.
You have more final thoughts?
I have more. I'm talking.
Cool. I'd say the main thing for me, I think this has been a really good idea to pull this workshop together, to have the diversity of people and backgrounds. And one of the things that's come out today, not just everybody's interest, but the incredible array of different techniques and questions being applied to this, with eDNA at the heart of all of these. So I think it would be premature to put in prescriptive standard testing at this point, but to be able to provide the background to explain and document the different approaches. So we heard earlier, setting minimum standards for the different techniques. Have that background information or metadata so that we can objectively compare them. We will work towards standardized methods at some point. Right now, it's evolving very rapidly. Let's keep evolving and see where we end up.
So I think that we're a little bit further along than some of the other folks. I think that we're ready to move forward on some standards for some systems and some species. I think that if our goal is standards that work for everything, we're never going to meet that goal. And I think there's a lot that we don't know. But I think there are certain applications, and we have the power to develop a good way to do them. We have the power to develop several good ways to do it, right? But we also can pick, for different applications, a good way to do things. Right? We have options, and we do have knowledge about how to detect things in difficult situations. So.
Thank you. I would concur with that, and I think that segues beautifully into the slide you'd like to show and the discussion point we'd like to make this evening.
Yes. There's a. Be careful, you might get hurt. From the thing coming down, I don't know. But yeah, thanks, Caren. That was a beautiful segue. Yeah, oh, look at modern technology. Isn't that wonderful? Yeah, so to finish off this segment, I guess, a bunch of us prepared actually a couple of slides, not just one. Sorry. And what we'd like to do is advertise for Sony. Okay. The second thing we'd like to do is to actually reach out to all of you and say, you know, we would like to propose a national eDNA working group. Yes, there are going to be challenges. Yes, there are going to be problems and all that kind of fun stuff. But there's a lot of really cool stuff going on at the same time. For example, we're pretty close to, you know, dealing with things like you know, minimum information and working towards standardization of field methods. For example, we have some excellent examples of that already from many of you in the room. In addition, same thing with targeted qPCR-based methodologies. Those two types of standards would be interconnected but distinct, obviously, because of the user groups, but also because of the techniques and so on. Where it's going to be more challenging is in the metagenomics, metabarcoding methods, and so on. And so what we're proposing is that we form this national eDNA working group with the goal to promote eDNA methods, best practices, working towards having some technical working groups that target these particular things, and as time goes on, you know, we might identify a few other things that might benefit from this, and also importantly, fostering the community of practice in order to educate people about eDNA use, and also to provide forums for sharing information and being able to effectively use this powerful technique, however frustrating it can be sometimes. But it's pretty amazing. And again, not to forget that eDNA is special. It's special because it really relies on these two also important components, the field component as well as the lab components. And they have to be working together in order to be effective. So bottom line is, we want you guys to be involved in various iterations wherever you can. And I encourage you to please contact myself or Bob in letting us know that you're interested in participating in this. And I'd be remiss without acknowledging sort of the core group that is really making this happen, and in particular the CSA group that's facilitating, helping us to achieve some of these all-important goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Caren. So I think that concludes our panel discussion. We want to open it up now to a town hall to get your thoughts on what you've heard today. Ask questions of the presenters, bring forth other ideas that you may have to help shape this. Because what I hope is starting to emerge is that we have a community of practice here in Canada that has a number of touch points internationally. Chris, you sit on this working group with the U.S. regulators. It was mentioned earlier today about the paper that Katie Klimas is developing. I think you and Caren and Goldberg are both on that. I'm wondering how far that new document goes towards some additional best practices beyond Caren Goldberg's 2015 paper. Do you want to make any comments about that?
The short answer would be no. Yeah, so basically this is, it's arisen from discussions among, it's called a government eDNA working group. It's being led by the U.S. Army Corps. Caren and I are both involved in this. And it's particularly looking at, this study is looking at limits of detection and limits of quantification. So Caren referred to this in her talk, saying basically how far can you go and at what point do you lose that power to be able to rely on the data. So this has been running a number of standards shared across labs and basically trying to look at limit of detection and limit of quantification because they're not at all the same thing. And the MyQE guidelines, have been sort of one of the primary go-to references for saying, this is the information that is required. The principles in that document are very, very good, but it was not designed around eDNA detections. It was more for quantifying levels of gene expression. So for eDNA, it's a slightly different set of questions. The principles are broadly similar. There's a lot of overlap. But it's basically arisen out of a common need.
Thank you, Chris. We're looking forward to seeing that document go public. Yeah.
Well, can I ask that?
Yes.
So I wanted to add that one of the things that was discovered pretty soon after all the data got sent together from different labs was that the limit of detection and the limit of quantification was a lot lower. Well, no, the limit of quantification was a lot lower for labs that were using robots than for those of us that use humans. And so even that element, right, changes. So it doesn't go with the assay, it goes with the whole workflow that goes with the assay.
Very good point. Thank you. So as we segue into the town hall, we have an announcement from Louis, the editor-in-chief of a new journal.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, but before I talk about the journal, so I guess what came out of the panel discussion is the need for partnership and do things together, collaborative research, and until now, we had great research, grant programs in Canada supported by NSERC. And many of us here, Bob, me, Dan, Heath, have been probably champions of using these partnership programs and programs with our government and the private, from the private sectors to do applied research to address issues of interest to our partners. And it would be very, very timely that we could keep these programs going and make use of it. So, but what's happening right now is that NSERC has been asked by our current federal government to change the game totally. So basically there's a plan right now to totally restructure the grant funding programs of NSERC. And there's some good sides of it. I mean, there's, so as written there, so there's good intent in doing so. So the new NSERC Research Partnership Program would encourage greater collaboration in Canada R&D system through increased support of projects that include both generators and users of research results and knowledge. So that's pretty, pretty good intent, but it's pretty much what's happening right now. The program, the way we see it as academia, we have been working just great. But the changes that they're proposing to do, we feel that could be potentially very damaging in terms of promoting partnership in collaborative research. For example, to do the type of research program we need to do to address those questions about uncertainties related to environmental DNA. So some of the key points that we're very concerned about, and that has been probably the key point of the success of those grant program, is that especially the strategic partnership program is basically totally based on in-kind contribution from the partners, either private or government. And what NSERC is proposing right now is that in-kind contribution will no longer be considered when determining NSERC contribution to a project funding. And that has the potential to be pretty devastating on many of the types of research we have been doing in partnership. And second, as it is right now, like the very important research partnership program, which is based only on require in-kind contribution from the partners, meaning that that NSERC is actually providing 100% of the cash for that type of research project. So now what they're proposing is that they would not go higher than 50%. So there would be a 40 to 50% cut to the level of NSERC funding to large-scale project, for example, as a research partnership program. And since in-kind will not be acceptable anymore, it means that any partners would have to contribute 50% in cash contribution to the project. So that's pretty scary in my view. And the last, well, there's other points into that, but the last one is like for non-profit organizations that are registered as charities can no longer act as partners, only as collaborators. And that basically cuts opportunities, would cut opportunities to a lot of people. So I just wanted to bring that up to you because, and it's time to react. And actually INSERC is asking for that. They want to have feedback from the community. So take note of that, that email address. So the Canadian Society of Ecology and Evolution, 800 members. We already sent a letter to the VP INSERC to manifest our concerns. But it would be really great that we have the people from the users and from the industry and ministries, if they are allowed to, to write to INSERC and to if you have concerns like we do about it. So please just pay attention to this because it's going to be a game changer otherwise.
Thank you, Louis. That's a really important point, and it's an opportunity for me to give a quick shout out to Mary Murdoch at Stantec and other collaborators that we've worked with. They've given huge in-kind contributions to collect these samples. You know, the cost of deploying helicopters into the field to collect these water samples is massive, and to erode that as a valid contribution to an INSERC grant is, in my mind, ludicrous.
Yeah.
So yes, please, one of the early efforts of our community of practice may be to mobilize and give comment to INSERC that this may not be a good strategy, at least for us.
I just wanted to clarify something. What this proposed restructuring means is that strategic grants don't exist anymore. Like, they're gone. In its place is basically what they currently have, the Collaborative Research and Development Grants Program, which is where you have to have 50% cash matching. So they're literally wiping out strategic grants totally. So
well, they even partly, well, they basically want to merge all the different programs into one single program. Even the Engage
yes.
will not exist anymore.
Yeah. Although it exists as like an entry level.
Yeah, but has been pretty useful.
Yeah. So it exists. Yeah, it still exists, but not in
and
name.
even CRD.
Yeah.
I mean, because INSERC basically can contribute 2/3 of the research, right? Because they match the in-kind contribution, which has to equate the cash contribution from the partners. So even CRD will, in its form, will be affected as well. So
yes, agreed.
It really reduces a lot the.
Yeah. So be angry.
Thank you.
Okay, so on the bright side. So anyway, I'm very excited to be able to make the formal announcement of Environmental DNA. That's a brand new journal dedicated to non-invasive molecular approaches for conservation, ecological, and environmental research. So I guess I'm not too good in innovation in eDNA, I guess, and so on. I like to do it, so I thought that my contribution could be my way to basically. I think we need a place to formalize things. As it is right now, when you publish eDNA work, it's spread in various kinds of ecological journals, high standard journals, and so on. But the editorial team is not necessarily dedicated, and you've got a few representatives here and there of the eDNA community in the different journals. But it's not to say that the journal is really dedicated to formalizing the field, setting standards, and so on. So I thought having a new journal would be the way to go. So here we are. So I convinced Wiley to get into this venture, and so we're launching it. So the aims and scopes. I'm defining environmental. So I guess we've been talking about real environmental DNA here, the way we visualize it. But the way I wanted the journal to be is to be much broader in scope for defining environmental DNA in a very broad sense. But in terms of characteristics, so environmental DNA will be a fully double-blinded, peer-reviewed open access journal. So open access journal, at least it means that it will be very easy for people not from academia to access any publication in the journal. Of course, there's a cost for people that publish into it, but it makes the science totally accessible to everybody. Double-blinded means that when you submit a paper, the reviewers don't have your names, they don't know who you are, and that may reduce biases and people being impressed by the list of names of authors and the feel less comfortable to give an objective assessment of the papers. So the journal will publish papers that pertain to the analysis of environmental DNA in the broad set that will include ancient DNA, non-invasive sampling, diet analysis, metabolite, metagenomics, microbial ecology, and pathogens. And we want to address questions of both basic and applied relevance in all forms. And research areas will cover as broad as possible experimental eDNA work. I think we talk a lot about the need for experimental eDNA work. Trophic and community ecology, paleo environments, biomonitoring, conservation biology, invasion biology, environmental assessment, physical eDNA properties, techniques and methods, and even application in citizen science and biodiversity education. And I'm assisted by an amazing team of people. So there's two little flags there. So Christy Diner, I think everybody knows Christy. Dagmar Frisch is more associated with resurrection, ecology, word seed banks, and so on. Thomas Gilbert is world famous in ancient DNA. Dan Heath is famous for all sorts of things. Very happy to have him on board. Margaret Hunter, working with U.S. Geological Survey. Michael Stapp from Australia. Phil Thompson, we saw reference to Phil's some of the Phil's paper this morning. Taylor, very happy to have him on board, and Japanese representative Iraki, so from Japan. So very international, and trying to cover as broad as possible as far as we define environmental DNA in the broad sense. And the team is complemented by 20 advisory board members or so, also very international with a good Canadian representation. Anais is here, and Bob is here, so great team. So we hope to be able to set high standards of eDNA research with the journal. So reasons to publish in environmental DNA is going to be the most comprehensive, actually it's the only one, the most comprehensive, fully accessed journal specializing in eDNA research. As you've seen, we have an excellent editorial and advisory boards composed of a well-balanced between males and females leaders in eDNA research. It's one of the very few journals that operate a double-blind peer-reviewed biological sciences. I think there's only 2 others. Another one that I co-founded, evolutionary application and ethology. We will cover all disciplines where eDNA analysis is relevant, including ancient DNA, and there will be e-transcriptomics as well. So RNA is always like implicitly part of it. And we will cover all conceptual, methodological, analytical aspects pertaining to eDNA research. So, and good news also is that Wiley accepted that the articles submitted during the first 6 months will be published for free. And what I learned just today is that we're ready next Monday to accept submissions. So submit your best eDNA stuff to us.
Thank you, Louis.
And then we can talk a little about potential of special issue. You want to talk about that?
Yes. We had hoped that from the combination of presentations, both oral and posters that we'll see later this evening, that there would be enough contributions coming from the Pisces workshop that we could have a special issue of eDNA dedicated to this workshop as kind of a launch to found our network in community of practice. So we would encourage those of you who think you might be able to prepare some manuscripts sooner rather than later. We'd like to get feedback from you on whether or not you think that's a reasonable idea. I think we've got a wonderful window of opportunity if we can do that within 6 months, and indeed if it's going to be a special issue stemming from this workshop, we should be able to do it within that time frame. Any comments from the floor about what you've heard? Anybody think they can get a paper in for the special issue?
I see at least 10.
Yes. I see at least 10 hands, so I think we've got the trappings here.
Well, after a couple of breaks tonight, we can throw again.
Yeah. Excellent. I really do appreciate you bringing up the point about these proposed changes to insert. You've always been a champion of what's right, and I think this is an example of what could be very wrong if they go down this road. So we do need to get comments in. particularly from not just academics who are obviously seen as biased and having a special interest, but also our industry colleagues who benefit from these kinds of collaborative programs as well. So with that, I think what I'd like to do then is we wanted to have a little bit of time for a town hall meeting for any and all questions, comments, concerns, observations from those of you who have participated. We want this to be very much a community of practice. We hope that this is the floor, not a ceiling, just to say that it's the beginning of our journey, that this is the first meeting, that there will be more opportunities for these kinds of activities. As we tried to organize this meeting, it was quite interesting. I was prodded by my academic colleagues saying, well, this needs to be a week long. We've got enough material. We could have at least 4 days of talks. Why are you only doing this for a day? My colleagues in government and industry said there's no way we can be allowed to go if it's more than a day. So we tried to compromise with our first workshop as being a day to get the ball rolling and look forward to next steps and hearing from you. Mary.
Bob, is this the first annual Pisces workshop?
I would like to think so. And, you know, I also want to use this as an opportunity to acknowledge all of our sponsors. We could not have had this workshop without all of the industry sponsors who stepped up and chipped in a little bit to make this possible. So to the extent that we would do this again next year, we'll continue to depend on the generosity of the community and their feeling that there's value derived from it. So I hope that you will go away feeling like this was a sound investment and that we would like to see another Pisces meeting. And I will, I can't believe I'm saying this, put myself on the hook to organize it again or help organize it if we deem that it would be better to move to another venue and move this around. If we're going to truly have a national network, we probably should think about opportunities to move it, but Guelph is certainly happy to continue to help get it off the ground. Yeah.
Maybe sort of a philosophical kind of question, but how can we as native barcoders or out there looking for environmental DNA have sort of kind of the impact, say we're putting up a photo on Twitter or trying to show a photo in a presentation when you got these guys holding these giant sturgeon and we're holding them tiny time. Does anybody have any kind of thoughts on that?
Well, you know what, you sparked a really interesting thought, which is to say, you know, we've filmed the conference today so that those people who were under travel restriction or students who didn't have the means to get here could see the presentations, because there was a lot of interest. A lot of students had reached out to me and said, are there travel bursaries? I really want to come. How do I get there? We didn't have the funding to support a lot of that, but we thought we could do one better by putting this on film. What we could also do maybe is think about a group photo. And it's not quite the same as a sturgeon, but you know, I think it does speak to the fact that we have nearly 120 people in the room today who were interested in this topic and can say, hey, I was here at the first Pisces. And I hadn't planned that, and I don't have a photographer, but I don't know, if we all moved up to the stage, could you get us into frame of view?
I'll work on that.
Well, I would propose before we wrap things up that we try that and see if we can get that last shot of the entire group, so that this isn't just me as a talking head, but it's a community of practice as a nice closing shot. I think that would give us at least one graphic. You know, and I get it. This is the geek wedding, as we heard earlier. But I look at some of these maps of habitat occupancy and things, and I get very excited about that. But I know I'm probably the special snowflake. Oscar.
Yeah, one comment on the working group. So I think it would be really important to have like a Canadian working group on eDNA, but I also think that there are a lot of other working groups, and I don't see that the working groups are very connected. So I think there are a lot of working groups worldwide, and they all work on the same problems. And to just prevent the same problem being solved 3 times with the same solution, I think we also should watch out that we really connect the working groups more. That goes out to all the working groups that are out there. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned it in your presentation, and it's come up earlier in the meeting. I mean, that's part of why I felt an impetus to act now to get this meeting going for Canada, because there is the DNA Aquanet in Europe. In some sense, I think other jurisdictions are already quite advanced in thinking about some of these issues. Certainly the amount of time and energy that went into the Asian carp issues in the U.S. and stuff. We've got a lot of good research going on, both basic and applied here in Canada, but we haven't yet really coordinated ourselves to begin to connect. So some of us individually are connected with these other initiatives, but we don't yet have a good conduit to feed that kind of information to the larger Canadian community of practice. So I think that's really key. Mark?
Hey, there's a microphone now. Great. To one of the previous questions, to get around sturgeon envy, just get 100-liter falconer tubes or episode tubes. But jokes aside, to the last gentleman's point, the other working groups and other jurisdictions and things, I know the Australians, CSIRO, folks there have genomics working groups. Federally, they work to do environmental monitoring with eDNA, genomics, other things, and they've got all kinds of interesting best practices. Mike Bunce, whose name I saw flash there on the list, Anthony Cheriton and the others, they sit on an Australian working group, and they do things for marine samples for looking at eDNA degradation. They'll spike their field samples with rhinoceros DNA, things like that, and then measure recovery in the lab and certain things. So they take a very hard analytical chemistry approach and some novel ideas. So there's some best practices that widgets and workarounds that other groups are already working with that I think you can leverage across and say not reinvent the wheel and various things. So very much.
Excellent. We're privileged to have colleagues from Ontario Genomics in the room who joined the meeting. They were very excited to hear what was going on, and I think we can count on them. And I know, Caren, you had discussions with Genome BC and in the Maritimes, so I think we can also look to Genome Canada to help to think about possibly serving in a role of coordinating information. We send the mic back to Helen.
Oh, before we get too further, questions, well, not necessarily a question, but from a consulting side of view, in order to get more buy-in, or in order to be able to incorporate more of these eDNA or uses of eDNA technology into projects, we're going to need more regulatory buy-in. So I know we're very cautious about not entering into creating standards right now, but what about lowering our expectations a little bit, and like Anne-Marie said, creating guidelines to get those published fairly readily, so that agencies have documentation that they can then interpret results, and we can start implementing this stuff on a greater scale and not solely rely on just academia or the weight on academia to push this through.
Yeah, good point. In the back to Helen.
Bob, I'll just quickly, since you sort of gave us a shout out, so we're part of the Genome Canada family here in Canada. They fund genome, for those of you who don't know us, Genome Canada funds genomics research across Canada. And I think there are some programs that the working groups, and the different labs, but also the working groups, once they get set up, should look at to fund some of this work. And I will also say that our GAP program does accept in-kind as the match. So let's use that. I'd love to see some eDNA projects. Call us when you're ready and we can help you apply.
Outstanding. Yes.
My girl.
I was just wondering what the panel specifically thought of the role of commercial laboratories in getting this to market from a really implementation or consultant perspective. I know it's got some includes here. But in terms of like Maxim or ALS, I mean, how do we take it from the kind of the arguments around process at the lab and bring that forward to standard process in the commercial lab?
Yeah, that's a great question. What is the role for commercial labs in helping to advance this? One of the things that we've done here through the research that I've had the privilege to conduct together with students and postdoctoral fellows funded by INSERC and Ontario Centers of Excellence is to develop some novel assays for aquatic species at risk. And we've heard that not all assays are equal. One of the first things that we did was to take them to our laboratory services division here that's part of the University of Guelph OMNR partnership that is an ISO 17025 methods development accredited laboratory, and ask them to do third-party validation. say, don't take my word for it. It might be enough to get a paper published in a journal, maybe not environmental DNA given its stringent review criteria, but to actually have someone else take these primers and do standard curves and validate third party that assay. I think that's just one example of how we can start to work with folks in that sector who do routine clinical diagnostic testing and will eventually be a key component of this kind of service provision that we envision for eDNA in the future, helping to kick the tires hard on these techniques and demonstrate which ones are fit for purpose according to ISO 17025 guidelines. That's just one place to start, and I think there are others.
Hi, thanks, Bob. So my name is Aaron Weir, and I'm with Maxam, and we are working with UVic to do exactly that. So at Maxam, we've done at least species of, I think, 10 now, interlab validation studies to answer that question of reproducibility, adhering to what inevitably we're pushing towards an ISO standardization 17025. So part of what Jared Hobbs presented was the BC Innovation Council Ignite Award. That is, part of that is looking at commercialization and the standard, not standards for the industry, but the lab reproducibility piece. And maybe that's something that would be publishable in the new journal. So
I would think so, because one of the things we also heard is that regulators want to see published assays. That's something that that the idea of proprietary assays may not fly for regulatory purposes if everything about their validation is hidden behind a curtain. We need transparency, and I think that's a great point. Thank you. Yeah.
I noticed that most of these...
Take the mic, please.
Thank you. I noticed that most of these studies are done in freshwater systems, and most of the methods developed around environmental DNA are based on freshwater systems. How do these experiences relate to other systems, for example, marine systems, estuarine systems, where the conditions are totally different and the challenges are totally different? And I'm wondering how that bias to freshwater systems might translate in any guidelines, protocols, workgroup focuses that are being developed.
Yeah, I mean, if I understand your question, you don't want to have an overemphasis on freshwater systems where the guidelines would be so prescriptive that it would be problematic for marine systems. And one of the things that we've heard is that somewhat counterintuitively to me, it seems like the persistence time of eDNA in saline systems is lower than in freshwater systems. So there could be implications for this kind of thing, I think, as you point out. So we have to be cognizant of these kinds of different applications. We also have to recognize that eDNA is not limited to even water. eDNA studies have been conducted in air and soils and will continue to do so. And so we have to make sure that there's an opportunity to engage all of the aspects of eDNA application. It's a good point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mark, again.
I like the way you say it again. One thing I wanted to touch on this morning, and it relates to a lot of the conversations we had back and forth, and rather than get the book and stress Rado, I decided to drop it. But in communicating science to policy decision makers, there was a great piece in Nature Communications just a couple weeks ago about they phrase it the power of optimism, which sounds very woo-woo, but the point being that decision makers look at experiential-based evidence sometimes more than evidence-based decision making. They've seen it, they've touched it, it worked. Highlighting the high points of what the data, what the technique can do, rather than the traditional scientific approach to bracket all the uncertainties, limitations, cautious, error bars as wide as rooms. So in terms of moving forward and communicating, especially in some of the inaugural editions of environmental DNA and those sorts of things, framing case studies of showing where it's worked, how it worked, and highlighting those, always keeping your assumptions and your limitations and those types of things clearly communicated, but not leading with them, rather than here's where it won't work, and here's how it did work, and here's how it will work again, and here's a cooler way we think it could work again, I think given a lot of, I mentioned this morning, there were lots of good examples of great eDNA science that were presented, and leading with a lot of those, that weight of evidence of sunshine for decision makers and policy makers to be able to show that. And there's lots of great examples from the room and others that we haven't collected where regulators have been involved hand in hand and it has worked. So getting decision makers to help communicate to decision makers is also key, rather than hearing it coming from the scientists all the time. Or if they're perceived as some kind of vested interest, that we want more money or we want more things.
No, your point's well taken, and it's an observation that I've made about academia in general. You know, that's through our peer review process, and as scientists, we're trained to be very critical, but sometimes the view from outside is that we circle the wagons and then point the guns inward. And that can make it look as though we're not very organized, our science is not very mature, when in fact I think the point you're making is a very good one. There's a lot to be excited about, and making sure we're communicating the glass is half full, not half empty. Other thoughts? Jared, you look like you've...
No. I wanted to know, I noticed today there's variation.
You want to take the mic, please?
Oh, sorry. I guess the point, and I really interrupted the session up front, but I wanted to ask about the number of technical replicates, because I see wide variation in literature. I see 5, 6, we use 8, I see 3 is widely accepted. And I wanted Caren, I'm going to put her on the spot, Helbing, to speak to why we arrived at 8 based on the work done by Marie Lesperance, looking at binomial error rates and driving for a statistical significance or confidence of 89%, and that's how we reached 8 as a number. So, sorry to put you on the spot, but can you speak to that, Caren?
I'm not exactly sure.
Well, why did you use 8 technical replicates?
Well, I mean, so we chose 8 for ours based on the statistical analysis and evaluating multiple primer probe sets, and then we asked ourselves, well, like what is the power associated with the detection at the different binomial rates? So with an N of 3, it wasn't sufficient in order to address the power issue. We found that with an N of 25, well, that was awesome. It was the bestest ever and stuff like that. But who's going to run 25 technical replicates? So exactly. So we ended up settling on 8 because it's easy to set up. It's not that much more expensive in terms of running, and I'm happy to talk with people if they're worried about cost. We can run our assays with ePlant plus a target species, like at cost without personnel costs and stuff, like for like $20. It's not that expensive to do, and yeah, like and we used an N of 4 for the ePlant because the frequency of hits is much higher, so we just adjusted that way.
And I think there's some interesting questions there. As I understand the importance of technical replication is it's a sampling issue. You have rare molecules in your extract. So it may be that, and I haven't seen a lot of published literature on this, but depending on the kind of extraction technique you're using and the reaction volumes that you're doing, what if we went back to 50 microliter reactions and then just put in twice as much extract? Could we get away with half the number of technical replicates?
No.
Why not?
Because you're using a binomial readout, and the readout is per reaction. So you're better off splitting the reaction into 2 than putting it all into 1. It's like the issue with pooling effects, like whether something's a real replicate or a pseudo replicate. In this case, you want to have multiple binary calls. So you definitely do not want to bunch up on there. And if you think about it, you think, oh, well, if we double up on a reaction or put twice as much in, we're going to get a better result. Well, yeah, you could, but if you think about it, 1 CT is equal to a 2-fold difference. So if you're doubling your reaction volume, you're only gaining about 1 CT equivalent, really. So it's not that big of a gain. So in all fronts, it's better to separate them out. We do 15 microliter reactions routinely.
No, I think there's lots of room for optimization. And I think there's also, you know, some systems, as you talked about, Caren, a lot of what we're trying to do is at the very edge of detection of very rare things. Some of the stuff that we've done with the Jefferson salamander and vernal pools here, where the eDNA is concentrating, as you saw in Steve's presentation, if we got a detection in one, we got it in all of them. You know, 3 was probably enough in that system because the eDNA was really concentrated and it was fairly trivial to detect. But as we moved into flowing systems like Carroll Creek, where we never got all 3 of our technical reps lighting up, we'd get 1 or 2, and we got them where we actually found fish with the double pass electrofishing. So we had some biological evidence to suggest that, yeah, you know, it's probably low quantity in the extraction, but it's a real hit. But I would, in that system, feel a lot more comfortable with upping the number of technical replicates, and that's, of course, exactly what you heard from Jay in his talk when we did the Red Side Days. We moved up to 6 for sure, and even there we were getting very few detections. That eDNA is rare, so you know that's obviously the folks in the UK doing the Great Crested Newt study have settled on 12. You know, where is the optimality point? I think, you know, we need more discussion on that for sure.
Yeah, and just to be clear, when we run 8 technical replicates, our cutoff on the lab call, it's explained in the protocol we wrote and we prescribed for our lab methods anyway, is 3 out of 8. You must get 3 of 8 technical replicates hitting to accept it as a positive in the lab. If we get less than 3 out of 8, if we get a 2-2-1 on our 3 biological samples, then there's a description under there how we make that cutoff and it lumps into the suspected site. So we rarely see a 3-0-0. You'll start to see that clustering. So that's why we have the lab call, and that takes a 3 out of 8 or greater. It's a mathematical determination, it's yes or no. Whereas the biological call looks at all 3 biological samples together and arrives at a determination of suspected or no or yes. So when you read the rule set that's written up in the standards, it makes it a lot clearer, but it increases the confidence that we have in the calls we're making.
Absolutely, and you know, and as we heard from Jay's talk on the DACE, I think there's also that importance of the field feedback too. All of a sudden you look at the sites, you've got forest cover instead of, you know, agricultural runoff, you've got hydrological, you know, groundwater recharge in these areas. It all starts to biologically make a lot of sense. So, you know, there are multiple levels of review, I think, that go into this. And to the consultant colleagues in the room, I think that really underscores the importance of your engagement in the project too. It's not as though a lab-based eDNA analysis is going to replace what you do. We still need that on-the-ground intel to interpret this data and report on it. Any other comments from the audience? We're just about to 5 o'clock. I'd like to start to think about wrapping up so that those of you who have posters can get over there and set them up, and we can get our group photo.
I'm working in a reservoir, so it's quite deep. And there's something we didn't talk about. I mean, the field is important. So where to sample? Is it better to sample at the bottom, surface, integrative?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. And you know, I think one of the things that we'll learn sampling through time in the fall, when you get turnover and we lose some of that thermal stratification, that might be a good time to bring things up from the bottom. It depends probably on the life history of the species you're looking at. I've got to believe that if it's a bottom-dwelling fish like a sturgeon, you're probably much better off sampling at depth than standing on the bank. We've certainly tried that. We thought the most extreme perverse case we could think of for detecting eDNA in a freshwater system was to go down to the mouth of the Niagara River and stand there with our Andy and sample 1 liter of water from the bank and see if we could get lake sturgeon DNA. USGS has some tagged animals there. We know that there are a few lake sturgeon coming in from Lake Ontario into the mouth of the Niagara River. They've got radiotelemetry data to prove it. We didn't get any DNA detection, and frankly I didn't think we would, but we wanted to try. So, you know, if we could go out into the Niagara River and sample at depth and perhaps more volume, could we detect even in that high flow? Maybe. Chris?
Just to partly address that, my lab's been doing some preliminary studies on that, and depth does matter. So and it'll also vary with season and even time of day. So, as Bob was saying, for benthic species, you will get stronger detections closer to the bottom. When David Lodge's group was first looking and see could this work for rusty crayfish, it wouldn't. But they were sampling at the surface. If you collect just off the bottom, it works beautifully for crayfish. So that's being done for both invasive and endangered crayfish species. If it just, as well as the ecology of the DNA, think the ecology of the organism and sample appropriately. We did this for some brook trout populations in Algonquin Park. And basically, when the whole water column is mixed, you can sample anywhere in the water column. But when it's stratified in the center, you have very poor success, basically, in the water that's too warm and too cold. One thing that's recently emerged in the literature is a challenge for eDNA is not knowing if your source is live or dead. They've been able to show for dead organisms, it's a stronger detection close to the bottom. Just last one on this, we've had some fun chasing ghosts two different ways, sort of marrying hydroacoustics with targeted single species DNA. And you can see basically dial patterns in what basically as species come up at night and then go down during the day. So it does matter, and you want to tailor your sampling to the ecology of the species.
Thank you, Chris. We're at 5 o'clock. We still have plenty of opportunity to continue the discussions, somewhat more civilly with drinks and hors d'oeuvres at the poster session, which will start at 6 o'clock in the atrium of the Science Complex. And parking on campus is free after 5 o'clock, so if you drove here, you can park near the Science Complex without fear of being ticketed. Make your way to the atrium. If you have posters to set up, the boards should be there and ready to get them set up. If you wouldn't mind please coming to the front, I'd love it if we could get a group shot before we disperse.
Yeah, well, since I'm streaming, I think it would be cool at the end to have, I'll pan over everyone. So it's not like a good after bar, but it'll capture everyone. I'll pan over everyone, you know, and that's kind of a nice one.
You got a computer, you can stitch it all together.
That's true too. Yeah, thinking ahead. Yeah. No, it's okay.
We all need to face
this guy over here. Yeah, and we're live. Yeah, we're live on the internet.
We are live on the internet. So we're. I I'd like to see if we can't get a chant going. eDNA. Ready? 1, 2, 3. eDNA! 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 Thank you.
Well, we need late certificates.
Oh! That's only 4, yeah.
Okay, go ahead, do it again.
8 replicants? It's your call. So all right. 3, 2, 1. eDNA! 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 eDNA!
All right, that's good. Actually, that worked really well, you know.
You did awesome. Thank you so much.
No problem. Actually, that'll be a moment at the end, you know.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I mean, seriously, we'll send it off to the computer geek in the lab. And
Yeah, you could just go like that.
see half of each. And
That's right. Okay, good stuff.
yeah, thank you. Hopefully we get to help get you to do stuff again, right?
I hope so. That was fun. I enjoyed it.
No, my computer. I can't leave it.